So we've now moved on, and today we're on the Chemin, which is a vital 20 to 30 mile ridge that runs parallel to the river Aisne. And if you look down there, you can just get an extraordinarily impressive view of the whole of the Aisne Valley, and then it goes all the way around. And the importance of this ridge has been recognised through centuries, because it was part of battles here fought in the Gallic wars and Napoleonic wars, and there were three main focuses of battle here in the First War, but it was a site of conflict really through the entirety of the 4 years of the war, and the total number of casualties here was on a par with Craonne. The first main battle was in September 1914, and after the Allies had managed to stop the Germans approaching Paris in the first battle of the line, I'm going to stop here because there's a trench we're about to pass. This is Chemin de Dam, that is now a standard road. We on again? So having held the Germans back, the Germans also identified further points which they could push through, and the Chemin de Dam was recognised as being a vital area of high ground. So it really became a race between the combined French and British forces, and this is really the lower end of the British sector in the First War, against the Germans to get to the front. War is coming. So, and the Germans basically force marched their forces to get here first, and really beat the British in the form of the West Kent and King's Own Scottish borderers by a matter of hours. And although by the time the Allied forces came to try and take the ridge, the Germans had fully entrenched by about 13th, 14th of September. And this meant that the British could only do one thing, and that was to entrench themselves. This was probably the first point in the First War that trench warfare became established. The second main battle was in 1917, in the spring of 1917. Nivelle decided it would be a good idea to try and take Chemin de Dam, by which time it was monumentally fortified by the Germans in its entirety. And basically it was a catastrophe. The French forces very strong defences, gas attacks, and appalling weather. And Nivelle really didn't recognise, or refused to recognise, that he couldn't take it, and carried on and on. And this was really the flashpoint for the French mutinies on the 1st, when the soldiers coming back from the front for furlough effectively said enough's enough, and it took Pétain to come down and really calm them all down. But despite that, a fair number of French soldiers were shot for desertion. And then the final was the second battle of the Aisne, which was in latter sort of September, October 1918, when the combined Allied forces, French, Americans and British, pushed through here, and that was really the beginning of the end, with the Saint-Mihiel offensive. So we're now going to carry on. We're in the middle of the Chemin de Dam at the moment, having cycled up from our campsite down in the Aisne Valley, and we're going to head up that way first, and then we're going to go to the Caverne du Dragon, and then we're going to other way to the other end of Fort La Malmaison. Here we are, further along the ridge, and it clearly isn't from the First World War. This is Napoleon Bonaparte, and this is a reminder that this ridge was a site of battles through the centuries, and you can see why we're just coming round, scanning round the ridge here, and it tells us over here about the Bataille de Craonne, 6th or 7th of March in 1814. The Imperial Army under Napoleon fought the Prussians and the Russians under Blucher. Afraid I don't actually know who won that one. Anyway, look it up. Now on the so-called California Plateau, which as you can see is a amazing vantage point looking down over the valley below, and there's some really good interpretation boards here, one of which is about the first aid post prior to the Nivelle Offensive, and it said out of 1,000 men wounded in action, 380 would have injuries to their legs, 360 to their arms, 130 to their face or neck, 70 to their chest, 30 to their head, and 30 to their abdomen. 80% of all wounds were sustained from shell blasts and only 20% from bullets. And inevitably wounds rapidly became infected in all the mud. And don't forget there were no antibiotics at this time, so it was all basically surgical debridement and amputation. So where we're standing is all fairly heavily fortified by the Germans, and down below in all this woodland over there were the French forces also dug in, and it was 16th of April 1917 that Nivelle decided he'd attack, and the attack went on for 3 weeks with millions of shells fired by the French, but to no avail because the Germans were so heavily entrenched, and eventually it was called off after 3 weeks. Just to give you an idea of the casualty rate, between the 16th of April and 15th of May, that's over 4 weeks, 300 hospital trains evacuated 80,000 wounded soldiers, which just puts it all into perspective. Just going back to the Nivelle Offensive again, just to reinforce why it was such a disaster, was partly predominantly the bad weather, which meant that Nivelle kept postponing the attack. So the Germans clearly had a very good idea of what was about to happen, considering the French had fired about an awful lot. When they couldn't send up there, so 500,000 shells over 5 days. I think it's just worth reading this whole interpretation board here, which just says it all. It says the French artillery crushed the Chemin with 6.5 million shells. The aim of the destructive bombardment was to wipe out the German defences before the assault. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the men set off to attack the Chemin Massif. Their advance was soon halted by German machine guns bursting from the shelters. Everywhere the assaults came up against formidable German resistance. The health services were overwhelmed. In the space of a few hours, the Nivelle Offensive turned into a tragedy. By the evening of the 16th of April, the hope of breaking the front had been dashed. Nivelle had undertaken to cease fighting within 24 hours if he did not succeed, but the offensive continued unabated until the 25th of April. On the 4th and 5th of May, the attack on the Plateau de Californie, which is where we're standing, and the Moulin de la Faux finally brought the French lines to the crest of the Chemin des Dames. The territorial gains, however, were minimal. And between the 16th of April and the 10th of May, France suffered 19,403 dead, including 10,000 on the first day of the attack, 73,183 wounded, and 2,162 missing, including many prisoners. Throughout the offensive, General Nivelle was subject to pressure from the political authorities and he was finally relieved of his duties on the 15th of May 1917. After such high hopes, the failure of the offensive plunged the army into deep malaise. General Pétain, who took over the high command, had to deal with the crisis of mutiny that mainly affected the Chemin des Dames sector. So we've now reached the eastern end of the ridge and to Craonne, and most notable probably for the anti-war song about Craonne that was banned until 1974, and this is the first verse of it. Goodbye life, goodbye love, goodbye to all women. It's over now, it's over forever. Since this loathsome war, we have to leave our skins on the Craonne ridge because we're all doomed to die. We're the sacrificial victims. Just lower down the slope, we've come to the cemetery of Craonne, which contains the bodies of 4,000 French killed at various stages during the war, and there was a big medical facility here, so obviously lots of them died from their wounds. And as well as French soldiers, there are 24 British soldiers here, and I can see 3 Commonwealth War grave headstones. Let's see what this says: a soldier of the Great War known only unto God. There's 2 more here, and again these are unknown names. So we're now at the Caverne du Dragon, a very good interpretation centre. Basically the whole ridge had up to 100 limestone quarries that had been used in the 19th century and were then deserted, and the French took them over initially, but then they were when the French were pushed out by the Germans in late 1914, they turned them into underground fortifications, and they could have up to 600 men in them, with everything to survive. It was a constant 12 degrees throughout the year, which was fine in winter. When it went down to -25 outside, it was pretty grim in the summer, and it was very high humidity and virtually dark the whole time. And the caverns were retaken backwards and forwards half a dozen times throughout the war, and there was one point when in fact the Germans had one half and the French the other half when they were together. But anyway, can't really show you very much, but it was fascinating. This is the cemetery of Cény-en-Lanois, which is really rather beautiful because it's much more planted up than all the others. Quite why this one is, I don't know. And it contains graves of more than 4,000 French, but also to show how international. Also a few Russian soldiers here, because the Russians, some of them fought on the Allied side, and then behind is a German cemetery, also containing more than 4,000 German soldiers, mainly in Ossuary, because the whole known bodies tended to be repatriated to Germany at the end of the war. And here we have Alphonse Jamais, died for France, 17th of April 1917. So that would have been in the Nivelle Offensive. And then over here So that's again 24th of March, that's Nivelle, 10th of April, 15th of August is a bit later on, 29th of November 1914, so that would have been right at the original battle. 11th of March 1917, 14th of July 1916, so that must have been just while they were general skirmishes. This one here, this is here I'm seeing, yeah, some Muslim grave. 16th of April 17, 4/15. So it's just a chain all the way through the war. This one, 15th of September 1918, which would have presumably been in the final offensive. So we're now at the western end of Chemin, and this is the German cemetery at just alongside Fort Malmaison, which is a collection together of all the Germans who weren't repatriated along the Aisne Valley, or the Aisne battlefront, and it's just vast. The number is, yeah, it's 11,850 graves in total, all the way around. We're now at just beyond the German cemetery at, well, hopefully it would be Fort Malmaison, but unfortunately it's closed unless you're with a pre-arranged guide, which is a bit of a shame, but there's some really informative panels here. Fort La Malmaison was built as part of the second line of defence of Paris in the 1800s. At this time the French had developed new explosives which they referred to as melinite, and they decided to test it on Fort Malmaison, which they duly did, and found that actually it was pretty effective, leaving a lot of it as rubble. So unfortunately this led them to the conclusion that forts then became a waste of time. So in 1914 they were really very lightly defended, and the Germans marched in quite happily, but then they reinforced the forts, which made it extremely difficult over the coming years for the French to retake them. But Pétain, after the fiasco of the Nivelle Offensive, decided to do something to encourage the troops a bit, so they had a concerted effort to retake Malmaison, which they did in the latter part of 1917, but then in the spring offensive of the Germans in 1918 it was retaken in a matter of just 3 hours, and it wasn't until September that it was retaken once again by the French. But anyway, a bit about Fort de la Malmaison, shame you can't see it.